Brenda, long time no see.
I know.
You been busy?
Yes, actually, I've had 3 meetings between seeing you this morning.
Oh, wow. You have been busy.
I have been busy.
Brenda, I was visiting my mom early this morning, and I thought I would take a stroll around your conservation area there, Binbrook,
Yeah.
because there's too many little hills that add up to a big hill at Brad's conservation area, Aramosa. So anyway, I had a half an hour, and I wanted to, and it is muddy, and I had my running shoes on, so
Yeah.
you owe me a new pair of running shoes.
So which way are you going in, though? Are you
I
going in
wanted
the
to look
gate?
at that. And I wanted to
Oh,
look
don't
at
do
that tree climbing thing.
Oh,
Why is there
tree
better
track?
trails?
Yeah,
Tree
there's
So
if there's a net.
sorry to interrupt, but
Oh.
we do have
Okay.
quorum, and we can start. So you can touch base about the conservation area afterwards. So
Sure.
ready to go, Lisa? Yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, and I'll call the Development Charges Stakeholders Subcommittee meeting to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and archived on the city's website. A reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. Members of the committee, please use the talk hand sign if you need to speak between items and raise a hand to move or second an item. We'll now be voting. Sorry, in this meeting, we'll just be voting by show of hands, so there's no electronic vote. So I'm just going to go through roll call. So we have Councillor Clark.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Pearson.
Present. Good day.
Hello. Councillor Johnson.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Councillor Whitehead. Not present. Councillor Farr.
Good morning or good afternoon.
Councillor Wilson.
Good afternoon.
Hello. Councillor Collins.
Good afternoon, present.
Thank you, Councillor. Michael Collins Williams. Not seeing him. Oh, there you are.
Present. I'm here.
Thank you. Thank you. Caitlin Laskowski. Caitlin, are you with us this afternoon? No. Paul I'm sorry, Paul. Say it for me.
Shaklowicz. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Paul. James Summers. James not with us this afternoon. And Sean Ferris. Not seeing Sean here either. Okay. And then our consultants, we have Nancy Neal. I see you, Nancy, and Gary Scanlon.
Here.
Hello, Gary. And Nancy, thank you. Item 1, ceremonial activities. We don't have any. So moving on to item 2 is the approval of the agenda. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
No, there are no changes.
Thank you. So you need a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Johnson. All in favor, just show of hands. Thank you. Carries. Any declarations of interest this afternoon? Not seeing any. Thank you. Approval of the minutes of our January 29th meeting. So I need a motion to approve the minutes from January 29th. Moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Wilson. All in favor, show hands. Thank you. And that's carried. On to item 7, our consent items for this afternoon. 7.1 is the development charges budget. And just need a mover and a seconder to put this on the floor for discussion. So moved by Councillor Johnson, seconded by Councillor Clark. Is there any questions or discussion on 7.1? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. I was the one who asked and moved the motion. And if I could, I think, Mr. McMullen, if he could just summarize the difference, particularly between the amounts, to try and reconcile the difference in the amounts between that which appears in Appendix A and that which is set out in Appendix B. And if you wouldn't mind, just for those who may be watching and don't have the report at hand, just summarizing what that direction was in advance of your summary. If I could ask that, please, through you, Chair.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, I hate to do this. I'm getting a lot of feedback. I think somebody's got their mic open. Sorry, I didn't hear half
Thank
of
you.
what Councillor Wilson said.
Just a reminder, if you can please mute if you're not speaking. Mr. McMillan, I see you there.
Yeah, so through the chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak to our report. Yes, we have staff on the in the meeting as well, Lisa Gillies and Alexandra DiDomenico, as well as Kirk Weaver, Mike Sagaric, Tony Sergi, and Jason Thorne. But regarding this report, yeah, we were requested at the last DC stakeholder meeting to compare the amounts that are in the in our capital budgets and in the last DC background study, and provide some tables and analysis on those numbers. So what this report does, it goes through a number of appendices A through D, highlighting a lot of that information. And if you look at table 1 of the report, and the report is called Development Charges Budget, Gross and Net. So when we talk about the gross expenditures that we have in the 2021 capital budget, which is in Appendix B compared to Appendix A, what is in the DC background study, what we find is there is a significant difference between what is in the DC background study and what is in the last capital budget. Now, recognizing that we're comparing a DC background study that was completed and approved in June of 2019, so that information would have been prepared a little bit earlier than June, obviously, to get into the background study, would have been based on 2018. So the numbers in the 2021 capital budget would have been prepared in the summer of 2020 in order to make it into the capital budget. And there's a difference, obviously, between those two gross numbers and also then the related development charge funding of those projects. So I think that's what this highlights is there's timing differences, the expenditures, there's about a 58% difference between the two numbers, and it's related to basically to the timing differences between some of the two data collection points, right, between the DC background study and the capital budget. And that's what, and there are some different assumptions that we make when we're doing the two documents. And what we have, we've determined, we've had this conversation over a few years, is that we need to get them to be better aligned and better synchronized, so that when we have the DC background study and the capital budget, the numbers are going to be more closely aligned, so that our capital budget forecasts going forward and the development charge related forecasts that are in those capital budgets can be better aligned and can show can show a better picture of our collections and our process for that. Lindsay, is there anything you wanted to add about that in particular?
Sorry, just real quick, Councillor Pearson, I think your mic is good.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Lindsay?
Thank you, Brian. And through the chair, Brian summarized it very well. One of the triggers that cause it is a difference between the capital budget and the development charge study as well is the level of growth that is being predicted each year. So in our capital budget, we try to ensure that we're going to be able to afford the projects that are coming forward. So we're largely using the growth forecast that we have seen in the past and trying to balance those with the needs that are upcoming. Whereas under the 2019 development charge background study, those growth forecasts may have been a little higher because we have to work to the provincial planning targets, but we don't want to put the city in a position where we overestimate our development charge collections and then don't have enough collections to be able to fund the infrastructure that we had committed to funding.
Councillor Wilson?
Thank you, Lindsay, and to Brian as well. I really appreciate that. I do have two supplementaries, particularly that last point made by Lindsay in terms of the variance that sometimes exists between provincial projections and that of local actuals. I was wondering if you could unpack for me at the bottom of page 2 of this consent report, there is a notation, just if you can make so that I understand it, of what staff is doing. staff have identified a gap between the master plans and the budget requests and are working with departments to understand the challenges in reconciling the two. Could you speak to that for me? What does that mean, and what are you seeking to reconcile? Thank you.
So through the chair, I can start with that. It's Brian McMullen. Yeah. So what's been determined is the master plans are also are needed and required to assist with the development charge background study, and they're also needed to assist with our capital budget and our long-term forecast. And we've identified that there's some gaps between the information that is shown and then gets reported. An example a couple of years ago would have been the transportation master plan. And I know some of the councillors, when the transportation master plan came forward, they sent us back to reassure council that the numbers that were in the master plan were then therefore in the capital budget. And when we do master plans, a lot of times they are some kind. I'm going to suggest maybe stretch targets in some case, and they're not necessarily always affordable. So we need to reconcile that, and especially as Lindsay just mentioned as well, when we're talking about our growth forecasts, they don't always align with what the province is expecting us to meet on the growth forecast. So we've identified these gaps between these master plans. We have a strategic growth initiatives internal working team amongst PED, corporate services, public works in particular, just the three main departments, looking to make sure that the master plan data and information gets into the background study and also gets into the capital budget, so we can have these all reconciled.
Councillor Wilson?
Sorry, Chair.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Do I have time for one more supplementary along that? And the nature of my questions are, I'm trying to better understand the risks or vulnerabilities of the municipality in the planning process for growth that may not be materialized. So I was wondering, my last question is to focus on the top paragraph on page 3 of this same report. And if I could ask Brian or Lindsay or whomever to unpack, which I think may speak to some of those risks of how we're supposed to go about financing these. Could I do that through you, Chair, please?
Brian or Lindsay?
Sorry, just working through the muting and unmuting. Yeah, so working through that. So just go into Appendix B quickly. Yeah, so when we compare the yeah, so when we compare the information in the regarding the collections, yeah, the collections are at a slower pace than within the provincial growth target. So so that just affects our ability then to construct the related capital projects that are required. And there's been obviously conversations in many of the capital budget discussions over the recent years about projects that we would then have to push off into future years when if we were able to keep pace with the provincial growth targets, then the construction would be able to move forward because we would have the DC collections sort of as planned in the provincial growth targets. And even in cases we are allowed in the development charge background study to debt finance projects when the collections aren't keeping pace with the provincial growth targets. So we're able to do some debt financing, and those related capital financing costs then can be recovered through the development charge background studies and the future DC bylaws. I hope that answered your question, Councillor.
Thank you.
Thank you. It does. It's, I think, an important paragraph for us and myself, and I think members of the public to read and understand the risks that are involved when we're upfronting, trying to finance, if I think what it's saying, finance infrastructure for populations that may or may not be realized. And we're left in the position of trying to be a bank and therefore may be served with the debt of that because of growth that may or may not be realized, if I've understood that correctly. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not sure if my question will be in order, so I'll leave it to you. It was maybe a year ago, at least within a year, I had moved a motion at GIC for a comprehensive transportation infrastructure study, and looking at front end loading the costs so that when we have occupancy of these subdivisions, we have the infrastructure in place to handle that occupancy. I think Councillor Collins actually seconded it. I'm just wondering if we know the status of that and how do we reconcile whatever comes out of that report with the DC studies that we're going to start doing shortly.
I think they're related because we're talking about timing. So I see General Manager Thorne.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, Jason Thorne, General Manager of Planning and Economic Development. So yes, Councillor Clark, your motion was is being dealt with through the GRIDS process. So when we come forward with the GRIDS work, the intention is to identify what types of funding models would be available for front-ending of infrastructure investment, whereas current practice is we wait until sort of some of that growth and development has occurred to develop the DC revenues prior to actually doing things like road urbanizations that ultimately support full build-out of development. So we're looking at, through the GRIDS process, bringing forward some of those models, and then depending on what direction we're given through the GRIDS process then sets the stage for the transportation master plan updates that have to happen across all infrastructure areas, and included within that would be an update to the 2018 transportation master plan. And that master plan update is what would feed into the next comprehensive DC bylaw update. So the kind of sequencing is some general direction through GRIDS, which would then inform the preparation of the master plans and the methodologies for those master plans.
So a supplemental, we're going to be adopting a bylaw in June of 2021. Is this the bylaw? What will this bylaw entail? Is it development charges for the next 5 years, or is this more narrow in scope?
So
Sorry,
yeah, so Brian McMullen again. So yeah, so through the chair, we're going to go through the presentation that Gary Scanlon's going to be giving, give an overview of what this DC bylaw update that is effective July 6th, 2021. We'll go through that to indicate what this bylaw does in this background study. But then we also we'll be having another a DC update likely in over the next 2 years as it fits into the process and schedule that Jason Thorne was mentioning.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, because I just wanted to make sure that somehow we're reconciling whatever comes out of that report and GRIDS with our future DC studies. So I understand, I think, where we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any further discussion on 7.1? Not seeing any, so there's a mover and a seconder. Can't remember who they were. You got it? You missed it? Okay, we'll redo that then. Who is moving this? Councillor Pearson and seconded by Councillor Wilson. All in favor, show of hands. Carries, thank you. See approved from Councillor Collins. Okay, so on to our 10.1, the development charges update study. Mr. McMullen and Mr. Scanlon from Watson Associates are here to present the update. And Brian, I believe you're going to give us the introduction.
Yeah, so through the chair, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction and overview of what's taken place. Gary will go through the full presentation. So it's just, yeah, it's basically to give you an update from our last meeting, January the 29th. We got direction at that meeting to move forward with the DC background study. I'll call it a mini background study. And then this is the opportunity to review the process that we went through for the mini DC background study. And then we'll also go through some of the steps that are still required, and just as a refresher from what we talked about at the last meeting as far as the schedule in order to get all the necessary approvals to have this bylaw and the rates in effect for July 6th 2021. So I think Alexandra is going to be showing Alexandra DiDomenico, shown as Alex DiDomenico in the boxes here. Alex is going to have the presentation that to help Gary run through. So over to Gary Scanlon. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Pleasure to be before the committee again. As it's the presentations being brought up, just to extend on the inquiry by Councillor Clark, what we'll be doing through this process is amending the present bylaw. So you passed your parent development charge bylaw in 2019. It has a 5-year life, and all we're doing is amending numbers and a few of the policies within that bylaw, but it'll continue for the full 5 years. And during that time, we'll come back in with updated information and updated background study. Okay. Most welcome. So if we can start the presentation, we're in, so we can go to presentation mode. It'll look a little bit better.
I think we need to go from the beginning.
Yep. So can you go to slideshow or?
Alex, just hit the first button there that says from beginning over on the far left of the screen. There you go.
You might have to hit it again.
Yeah, you might have to hit it twice.
As long as we don't have to turn it off and turn it back on.
Hold the pressure. So she's saying it's having problems with the screen. Is it able to move at all, or even on small? Can we progress through it, or does somebody else need to take control of it?
Could we do it through?
There, okay.
Oh, okay.
So suggestion, Alexandra, pull your cursor down towards the bottom. Okay, move across to the right, and just before the slider, there's a little button there just before where it slides negative to positive. Just to the left of it, you see that little go down, straight down. No. Okay, one over to the right. To the right. Okay. So just beside the negative mark, just to the left of the negative. There you go. Hit that one. That should, in theory, that's how you can start the presentation.
Or not.
Okay. So she'll just have to click on each of the slides on the left-hand side. So can you click on number 2 and pull it up? There you go. There we go. So I apologize for that. So we're just, as was noted, we prepared the background study. It was dated March the 5th and was released. So now that starts the mandatory public process, and I'll go through the timelines a little bit in a moment. So what we'd like to do is to just provide the highlights of this document. We'll give you a little bit of a recap on what topics we touched upon with the first stakeholder meeting, and then we'll move through to the calculations, et cetera, that's contained in this document. So if you can click on number 4. Perfect. So we talked about this process the last time. We had been engaging with staff starting at the beginning of the year to look at the potential changes that have arisen through the 4 different bills that were passed since 2019. So we had Bill 108, Bill 138, Bill 197, and then Bill 213, 217, 217. So that's 213. Okay, getting my sevens and threes all confused. So we've been incorporating those changes into the calculations we'll present today. And also, as you read through the document, there's some policy changes we have to incorporate, which we talked about last time. So things such as there's staged payment timing for nonprofit housing, institutional development, delayed or the freezing of development charges for zoning bylaw applications or site plan applications. So we went through all of that the last time, and I'm not going to repeat it, but it is articulated within the body of the document, and we've incorporated it into the draft bylaw that's attached. So if you can go to slide 6, we're just kind of skipping through the dividers. So that's, as I've noted, we went through a Development Charges Act overview, so everybody had a starting point. We talked about these changes and the methodology, and then what we were going to undertake through this process. Slide 7. And then 8. One of the things we talked about is there are adjustments that are allowed for. So the key one being the province has removed the 10% deduction on the softer services. And in order to incorporate that 10%, we just had to be mindful that in these adjustments, we're not exceeding service standard calculations. So we're not, and I'll show you that shortly. But we went through the detailed calculations on those service standards that would change, just to make sure that in these adjustments, we didn't exceed that part of the mandatory calculation that's provided by the Act. If you take a look at the next slide, this is the product of looking at quality and quantity measures over the past 10 years. We went through a bit of a detailed presentation last time. I'm not going to go back through that. But at the end of the day, these calculations at the end give us a maximum amount that we cannot exceed in our development charge calculation. So if you recall the methodology, we start with the gross cost of the projects, and there's a number of deductions. We get to the end, and there's a net amount that we base the calculations on. So as we move through those calculations, one of the checkpoints is to not exceed the service standard measures. So we've updated those. Each of these here are the services that we've considered as part of these calculations. So Public Works, Parks and Rec, Library, Ambulance, Long-Term Care, etc. You can see an extensive list here. So we've updated the calculations. As I say, as we move through, we have not exceeded any of those costs. So that's a checkpoint for us, and we've met it. And now we move on with the calculations. Next slide on 10. Just a quick recap. We went through to talk about the capital costs that we can include. You can see that the definitions are quite extensive here. We can get land, we can improve the land, so we can do put in landscaping, put in parking lots, put in the water, the wastewater services, hydro, any types of facilities for eligible services, equipment, rolling stock. So the listing is quite extensive. And so with this particular list, we've continued with it, and there's been, for the most part, no changes to the definition or the types of capital works that we've included. The next page just further qualifies that. The top part of this, there are certain types of capital items we can't include. So parkland acquisition, vehicles and equipment has to be significant so they last a long time. And then certain types of computer equipment we can't include. So once again, we've not made any changes. This is solely for a recap. We talked about the planning horizon. They've opened that up. We used to be limited to 10 years for most of the services we listed the service standard on. We've been limited to a 10-year planning horizon. We, in the future, when we come back, perhaps on the next update, maybe we'll look at a longer term because we'll be looking out to the build out of grids. We'll have master plans that for parks and recreation, for example, that may take us out over 20 years. So we may expand the time horizons that we're looking at these services next time around. But because this is just an update to the calculations of the study that was done 2 years ago, we're not making any of those modifications right now. And then as you can see, there's grant subsidies, other contributions, and we've ensured that we've observed that in updating the calculations. Slide 12 just really highlights the actual calculations that we've done in the background study. So the first, they removed that mandatory 10% deduction for soft services. So that impacts the calculations we did for ambulance, waste diversion, parks and rec, library, long-term care, public health, childcare, housing, POA, public works, and growth studies. So we've revised all the calculations to remove those deductions that we had made before. We did remove for parking services and airport, those services as well. We've removed those, the 10% deduction. So those services have increased as well. But because of the changes that they introduced under Bill 197, municipal parking and the airport servicing is basically will be removed as of September 18th next year. So we've made the adjustments, but these services will only last for basically another 1.5 years, and then they have to be removed from the calculations. So we've set up the bylaw to acknowledge that those services will no longer be collected for as of September 18th next year. So looking at the details of the capital project listing, for growth-related studies, we've removed some of those studies related to services that we can no longer collect for. So we have removed any of those master plans and such that we can't collect for. There are certain studies, such as official plan, more of the planning studies, where we've had to make some adjustments to, because planning studies, planning isn't an eligible service, but when you get into studies such as official plans, all of the policies and the growth forecast and what the direction that's given towards those services is identified under the official plan. So there's a portion of the OP that we can continue to collect, even though planning is not an eligible service. So we've made the adjustments within that as well. There are it's next. So we've talked about moving out the, one of the things is the parking study was under growth-related studies. And so what we've done is we've moved the parking study out and we've added it to parking service. So then that whole calculation drops off as of 2018. So it was an easier way to move it out of one category and put it in another. So it was easier to make the appropriate adjustments for the removal of that service. Next slide. And then the one area that we made a bit more of a significant change, and it was really to one of the projects that we had included in the background study, is with Macassa Lodge, and this is the D-Wing expansion. So that staff report has recently come before council, and we've got fine-tuned capital cost estimates. So we've revised what was in there from the 2019 study. We also know that we are getting some grants and subsidies, so we've included that as part of the calculations. And basically, we've looked at the growth component of that. Part of that D-wing is to replace some of the beds that are located elsewhere in Macassa Lodge. And then there's also been an expansion to that facility. So we've made an adjustment between the growth and the non-growth of that particular project. At the end of the day, you'll see, and I'll show you later, that the adjustment in that particular category hasn't dramatically changed, but I wanted to point out that there was a project refinement in there that we incorporated as part of the adjustment. And then the last item is, once again, for ineligible services. There may have been a few vehicles that didn't meet the eligibility test with the adjusted changes of the legislation. So we've made that adjustment as well. Slide 14. So this just gives you for isolating those particular services. And once again, all the numbers I'll present are in 2019 dollars because that's when we passed the bylaw. So in effect, what we have to do is we have to put everything back into 2019 dollars, adjust the schedule that was included in the bylaw, and then staff will index it with, we're allowed to index the charge for inflation. So they'll re-index that charge to bring it up to today's dollars. So everything, as I say, I'm presenting it back in 2019. So for the most part, this is the updated capital costs and the appropriate adjustments that we've made. And the most significant items that we've removed are the 10% deduction. And once again, a few tweaks to removing either some vehicles and equipment or some studies that are no longer there for ineligible service, and a slight change to the long-term care services for Macassa Lodge. Next slide. And when several slides back, I gave you the maximum amount that we could collect under the development charge service standard calculation. So that's what the left-hand numbers column is. The right-hand column is the amounts that we're pulling through into the calculations. And you can see in each instance, we haven't exceeded that particular estimate. Okay, so once again, I talked about needing to ensure that we don't exceed it. So this is a test and a check mark beside it. We can continue on with our calculations. So now we'll move into the charges, the updated charges that we've provided. And slide 17 gives you, in essence, the updated calculations, which would find themselves in the bylaw. So the development charge bylaw update, we would be including this particular schedule. You can see we've got, starting from the left-hand side, the charges related to single detached, semi-detached dwellings, so your low density. Moving next, we've got the townhouses, your medium density. And then we've got, in essence, 3 categories of high density, small and medium-sized apartments, and then we've got a calculation for special dwellings, basically what you'd find in a retirement home. So they have a smaller persons per unit, and we've calculated a special charge for that. And then the last column is our non-residential charges. So you can see this gives you the full extent of the calculated charges. Focusing it more on the change between the prior bylaw and what we're looking to update is presented on slide 18. So if we look at the charges, obviously we highlighted the yellow, those services in yellow where you see the changes. So the overall, the adjustments we're making would increase the charge. Probably it's easier to look at the municipal wide services, the 25,311 versus to 26,454. So that adjustment there is $1,143 increase. So with the expanded calculations that were allowed for under the Bill 197, we can actually increase those charges by a little over $1,100. Now, with one hand, the legislation giveth, and on the other hand, the legislation taketh away. So you can see that the last two services in the yellow, the municipal parking and the airport, will basically be removed as of September next year. So that'll be a reduction of $1,030. So we'll increase 1,143 starting July of this year, and then September of next year we'll drop it again by 1,030. So it'll be a net $113 difference in the calculation of the charge. And the next slide just presents the adjustments on the non-residential side. And you can see that it basically changes from, once again, looking at the municipal wide, because that's where the changes are, we go from $11.18 per square foot to $12.21. So we're looking at roughly $1.03 adjustment on a per square foot basis. So looking at moving ahead, slide 20 gives us the process. So we filed the study, or the study will be officially filed with council on A&F on March 25th. So we've set that as the official starting date for the public process. And we've moved ahead, and council would be considering the bylaw on June 9th. So we've more than exceeded that 60-day period. In between that, we'll have the mandatory public meeting, and that'll be on April 22nd. So we'll move from officially giving it to A&F. We'll have the public meeting, receive input from all interested parties. Those comments will be considered by A&F on June 3rd, and then council will consider the bylaw on June 9th. The effective date, the indexing date for the bylaw is July 6th. So we've chosen to make that adjustment as of July 6th. So these new rates plus the adjustment for indexing will all take effect on July 6th of this year. Next slide. And again. As I've noted, July 6th will be the target date for implementation. Obviously, what we've presented today is in 2019 dollars, so they'll be indexed for 2 years to bring it up to 2021. It's noted that in certain instances, not all of these charges will be exactly as everyone will pay. You'll recall we did some adjustments. For example, we did the phase in the downtown CIP area. So those changes would be impacted by what we had determined under the existing bylaw. So the existing phase in continues, although there may we would look at these new rates. Not a considerable difference, but it is what it is. So on an annualized basis, we work with staff, finance staff, to take a look at what would be the annualized impact in the collections. So that based, if we assume 1,800 single family units and about 950,000 square feet of non-residential development, it would be about $3.1 million increase in your annual DC collections. So that gives you the impact up into September 18th next year. But then remember, we're losing 2 services. So the reduction will be accounted for, and we'll look at roughly about a $2 million increase annually as a result of these overall adjustments. Next slide. So on a percentage basis, we'll see roughly about a 2.2% increase on the residential charges and about a 5% on the non-res. That will be in place for, as I said, a little over a year, about 15 months. And then the net impact as of next year will be honestly, about a 0.2 overall increase on the res and about 2.5 on the non-res. And last slide, 24, just gives you, once again, the high-level summary. Now, just to point out before I hand it back and take any questions, we did talk before that there are changes on things such as collection policy. There are changes in some of the definitions we need to have in the bylaw. We've articulated that in our last presentation, and those have been included in this document. I just didn't go through them once again in this presentation. I'm not sure if Brian would like to add anything to the concluding remarks before the chair takes it back.
So through the chair or through Gary, thank you very much, Gary, for the presentation. And yeah, staff have worked with Gary's team to get us where we are today. And the DC background study is posted on our website as well.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Gary. If we can just take the presentation down, if it'll cooperate. There we go. Thank you. So any discussion on the presentation, questions for Gary and or Brian? I see Councillor Wilson. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Gary. You just said something that caught my attention, and I want to make sure I understand it fully. And it was on, I think, slide 17, in which you referenced retirement homes and the rationale behind the charge. You referred to smaller units. Could you unpack that? So it's the size of the unit, because before my supplementary question, I just want to make sure I understand what you said on that. Thank you.
Through the chair, I may have said smaller unit. On average, perhaps they are or they aren't, but what we know is that there's a lower occupancy in let's say the retirement homes on a per unit basis. They normally have lower occupancies, roughly about 1.1 person per unit, whereas a small apartment, as we've deemed it, a bachelor or one bedroom, runs about 1.5 people per unit average. And then you've got large apartments, 2 bedrooms or greater, that run in excess of 2 persons per unit. So we've stratified the charges for residential based on the average occupancy in that category of dwelling units. So that's what I meant by smaller. It's a smaller occupancy.
Thank you. Therefore, could you speak to student purpose-built housing, like residences, which typically are very small units, and there are some proposals coming up that are quite small that I can't see more than one person living in?
I would have to look at the bylaw to answer definitively on that, Councillor. And I do not have the bylaw, the full bylaw in front of me. I don't have it open, but it's something we can get back to you on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yep, I do have a supplementary, again, if you will. You spoke about the macro consequences of these changes, but just for public consumption, I was wondering if you could speak to it on a service level. So specifically the parking services, and I think the other one was the airport. What does that mean for how a city develops? Like, what could be the consequences of that be? Thank you.
If we go back to, if I refer you to slide 14, you can, if you take a look, slide 14 presents the amount that we're recovering from development charges while we were anticipating recovering was, sorry, there we go. It's small printing. It was roughly about $22 million over the 10-year planning horizon. So we would now, of course, we were able to collect it for the first 3 years. So the 22 million would have been the 10-year collection amount. So let's call it 7/10 or 70% of that 22 million. So we'll be losing roughly about $15 million over the 10-year planning horizon. And for the airport lands, they were about $19 million. So once again, we'll lose 70% of that number. So in total, it's roughly about 40 million. We'll lose those $40 million. Because we are allowed to collect for 3 years, maybe we'll collect 30% of that, but we'll ultimately lose about $28 million as a result.
That's some fast math, Gary.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and watch the tape. But thank you. I guess what I'm trying to, that was helpful, but what I'm trying to understand is, as a consequence of that, what, from a policy perspective, could that mean for a municipality in its land use decisions, if any?
Well, if you are able to incorporate and absorb those costs as part of your capital budgeting process, you would continue with your present policies. If from a financial perspective now, you aren't going to generate those funds, you'll need to figure out whether your planning policies push more of a burden onto individual developments or whether you modify your service levels, say in the downtown where you'd normally provide for municipal parking.
Sorry,
so thank you.
Just
if I may,
Manager Thorne.
Yeah, through you, Chair, how does this impact, say, our parking study, which I think is outstanding, or from your perspective, Jason, how does this inform you as our GM of planning and active? Thank you.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. So we do have the parking master plans as coming to the April Planning Committee meeting. And so we have been developing that in full awareness that these DC changes were coming down the pipe. So, the shorter answer is it does mean there are fewer revenue sources to finance things like a new municipal parking structure, which, DCs to date have been used to sort of develop a bit of a reserve to support the creation of parking supply. That said, not so much because of this particular DC change, we were heading down this path anyways. But really what we've been looking more at is more of an integrated approach to providing public parking supply. So opportunities for integrating with new development, or opportunities for integrating even with existing development where there is surplus parking supply. So much less of an emphasis on the creation of new standalone parking structures as may have historically been done, and more about, if you can imagine a new condo project going in the downtown, maybe there's a floor of that parking that is available for the public, while the rest is for the residents, and also a much stronger emphasis on shared parking requirements. So where you can provide daytime parking on the public market, and then in the evenings it's available for residents when they may need it more often. Those are the kinds of solutions that we're focusing much more on through the parking master plan.
Councillor?
Thank you. And if I could ask Mr. Thorne if he would like to provide any comment with respect to the airport component.
Through the chair, similarly, we are having some discussions around our current relationship with the airport through the airport subcommittee, and I think some of the changes to what is fundable through the DC program may be of relevance to that. Those are sort of confidential discussions that we're having with the airport, so that's probably about as much as I can say at this time.
Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Councillor. Further discussion on the presentation, questions? Committee? Not seeing anybody. Paul, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question that I'm not sure if it's in order at this point in time, but I thought I would pose it to Gary. It was mentioned earlier on at the beginning of your presentation, you brought up Bill 213 and some impacts that it might pose on the city's current DC bylaw. I was wondering if you could speak to some of those changes from Bill 213 specifically, please.
Through the chair, 213 basically provides for an exemption for universities that are funded by senior levels of government.
Okay, thank you for that. And then following up to that, just quickly, I didn't see anything in the presentation regarding it, but related to that, then how does that provincial law then impact the municipalities' bylaw moving forward, or the amending bylaw moving forward, please? Thank you.
So through the chair, obviously that's a mandatory exemption. So we've provided the definition and for the exemption to be included in the bylaw. That means that where the municipality historically may have been able to recoup revenue, that revenue is no longer available to them as a result of this exemption.
I see. Okay, thank you. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions from committee? Anybody? Not seeing any. Thank you. So I need a mover or a seconder then to receive the presentation. Moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Farr. All in favor, just show of hands. It's received. Thank you. And then a mover and a seconder to receive the development charges update study. Who'd like to move that? Moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Farr. Is there any discussion on the report? Nope, not seeing any. Okay, so then all in favor, show of hands. Thank you, that carries. Flip the page without licking my fingers. So the last thing on our agenda for this afternoon is the appointment of chair for 2021 to 2022. Just open the floor, I guess, to nominations. Councillor Farr?
I'll move yourself, seconded by Councillor Collins.
Thank you. So I guess we need to vote on that. All in favor, show of hands. Thank you. And then we'll also need to have a appointment of a new vice chair. So I'll open the floor again to nominations for vice chair. Anybody? Councillor Wilson?
I just want to make some clarity. Are we allowed to nominate citizen members, I'm assuming?
I'm getting yes from Elsie Kelsey.
Okay, I'd like to nominate Paul, please.
Okay, nomination for Paul for vice chair. Paul, do you accept the nomination?
I do. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Excellent. Okay. So who wants to second that? So moved by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Farr. And then we'll vote. All in favor, show of hands. Thank you. All right, Paul, you are officially vice chair. Thank you. Are we good then? Yeah, okay, so motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor, who hasn't moved anything today? Councillor Farr, all in favor of adjournment? Carried, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.
Great, thanks, Nancy.